We have a great program for you today. It's called All Hands on Deck: Civil Society, Government, Business, and System Change. So the theme is system change. And we have three great panelists to represent those three segments of our society: business, civil society, and government, to present to us their thoughts about how we can bring system change, how we can really create that new economy out of this old economy, how we can make this transition. So let me introduce our speakers all at once here. I've told them to try to limit their time to about 10 minutes so that there'll be plenty of time for discussion with the audience and dialogue, and I know they will. I'm going to introduce them first, and then I'll try to set the stage a little bit myself and sit down and be quiet. The first presenter will be David Levine. David is the founder and the chief executive officer of American Sustainable Business Council. This has been a remarkable thing that I've seen happen over a very short period of time. The organization now represents and has organizations in it that represent over 165,000 businesses and more than 300,000 entrepreneurs, owners, executives, and other business professionals. It's just been phenomenal what David has done. For over 30 years prior to that, he's worked to bring novel sustainability solutions to businesses, business challenges, and to educational systems and elsewhere. And he's even been a bit of a businessman himself. Our second speaker will be Nikki Silvestri. Nikki is known to a lot of you as the executive director of Green for All, this wonderful organization that champions bringing together social justice issues and environmental issues, green jobs, and a lot more. She's worked as an advocate for environmental and equity issues with underrepresented populations in a whole host of different areas now for a long time. And she was a former executive director of People's Grocery in Oakland. And when she was there, she developed an innovative business program for food entrepreneurs in the racial justice programming and in managing the creation of a multi-million-dollar economic development collaborative. And our third speaker is Sylvia Hayes, the founder and the chief executive officer of 3E Strategies, a clean energy and economic consulting firm. She's also the first lady of the great state of Oregon. For 23 years, she's been working professionally in sustainable energy, economic development, green jobs, green buildings, sustainable forestry, and agriculture. She co-chaired the effort in Oregon that led to the renewable energy standard, and she's now deeply engaged with her husband and the state in a host of areas that are very important to what we're talking about here, and we'll hear from Sylvia also this afternoon. I want to make a few remarks about how we talk about changing the system. We talk about moving from this new economy to a new economy, from this failing old economy. And I've thought a little bit about what are the forces in our society that might actually drive transformative change. How can system change come to America? And I want to mention, I think there are 8 sort of well springs, 8 areas where driving change can occur. The first is that people, it happens when enough people not only get fed up, but get fed up and see the system as the problem. When we have problems emerging across the whole spectrum of national life and economy, environment, society, politics, it can't be due to small reasons. The reason is that we are in a system that is failing us. And so the first factor is when enough people come to see that the problem is the system. The second driver of change, of course, are crises themselves. And I'm afraid we're fated for more coming at us down the pike. And this climate crisis is a tsunami right offshore. A third driver of change is what I call progressive fusion. We'll see real change when things happen like are happening in this room and in this conference, when the different progressive communities come out of their silos and fuse into one powerful force. We've got to get out of those silos. And there's no group that is more problematic in that regard than my tribe, the environmentalists. The fourth driver of deep change is to have a very powerful, positive vision of the future. And we're forging that here today, and we need to spend a lot more energy on that. You may remember what Victor Hugo said, there's nothing like a dream to create the future, utopia today, flesh and blood tomorrow. The fifth driver of real change is the concrete examples that you are building around this country and around the world. When people look up and see the better world happening, that's the biggest inspiration we can give people. That's the biggest driver of change that we can create for people. To bring the future into the present, principally in our communities and in our states, where we still can do these things today. The sixth driver of transformative change is, of course, transformative leadership. When we have a crisis, it hopefully will occur in a time of transformative leadership. And where there's a powerful narrative, a story that makes sense of what's going on around us. Bill Moyer said, America needs a different story. So let me tell you what I think up front, he said. The leaders and thinkers and activists who honestly tell that story and speak passionately of the moral and religious values it puts in play will be the first political generation since the New Deal to win power back for the people. The seventh force, the seventh driver of deep change can be when we finally come together and start driving a movement for pro-democracy reform in our country. Getting the kind of changes that some of us have been discussing here that will return power to the people, that will reverse the ascendancy of money power over people power. And the last force for change, I think, is when we build together the most powerful grassroots movement this country has ever seen. And we see a rebirth, as we are seeing now, I think, of activism, of protest, of direct action, of civil disobedience. So when those forces come together, we're going to see in America the kind of deep transformative change that can lead us. Eventually, we will wake up one day and look around and say, by gosh, we now live in a new system of political economy. Thank you. David.
New plan. Is that, if it's on? It's on. Yeah, it's on. We're good to go. Thank you. Thanks, Gus. And see, this is the problem then. All right. So, real pleasure to be here this afternoon and to sit as a part of this panel. And my role was to really begin to bring the voice and the stories of the role of business in creating systemic change. But as I sort of move through the remarks and as you hear the others, I'm sure the piece to reinforce is, number one is that none of these pieces alone are going to make this happen. I think as we've been hearing over and over, the theme of the conference and the like is how does, in this case, business work with government, work with civil society? How do we all move these things together? Different voices at times, different words, same common goal. Same vision of building a new economy, a more just, vibrant, and sustainable economy. And in that also is that, as has been said, if it's inclusive, then as you hear the remarks, think about your piece. What moves you? What's your passion in all this? And how we can work together to bring that forward. Because as we heard, it's the uniqueness of each of your own contributions in that broad diversity that gives us the power to move this all forward. So now to the business frame in this. You know, about 35 years ago, the only frame that people had for understanding responsible business was Ben and Jerry's and The Body Shop. Yeah, that was it. It was like that's all you heard. There's this thing, socially responsible business. Those were the companies that they talked about. But now the businesses that are, and the business organizations that are working to create a new economy comes in so many different shapes and forms, geographies, sectors. And these companies that have emerged and the business organizations that they're a part of cover the gamut of micro enterprise, social enterprise, green, sustainable, triple bottom line, women's-led organizations, Main Street, local living economies, community-rooted, economic development organizations, investor and business incubators. Many forms in fashion to what business now is and what enterprise is, all based on a different set of values, yeah? There are strong and growing movements at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, and all looking for the new solutions and the role that business can play in their communities in the world. So I want to take you through some of the market shift work, some of the incredible work that folks are creating through businesses and business organizations, some of the business groups that we work with. And so you can hear some of the stories, and many of them are in the room, and many of them are presenting in workshops, so you get to see them as well. There's the work of building local economies, yes, by groups like the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, the American Independent Business Alliance, and the work of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and the hundreds and hundreds of business organizations from Local First Arizona to the Metro Independent Business Alliance in Minnesota to the emerging change makers working with communities of color in Alabama. There's the innovative work of the Northwest Atlantic Marine Alliance building new models and policies for sustainable fisheries. The work of the National Latino Farmers and Ranchers on building sustainable agricultural movement through the emergence of new Latino farmers. The work of Healthcare Without Harm through Kaiser Permanente and all these other hospitals that are ridding the hospital systems of toxic chemicals, like Kaiser Permanente just announcing no more toxic flame retardants. There's the Ownership for All movement that comes in the form of worker ownership, union cooperatives, worker cooperatives, the work of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, One Worker, One Vote, the Evergreen Cooperatives. There's the clean energy work led by groups like Green America, introducing a bill that we're working on called Clean Energy Victory Bonds in order to finance our clean energy economy. There's the work of the South Carolina Small Business Chamber of Commerce that's going door to door with businesses along the coast of South Carolina, and they're putting up ribbons across their store. This is where my business will be in 20 years. Climate change is not good for business. It needs to be addressed and addressed now. There's the breakthrough work of businesses like Patagonia that are addressing things like consumption and saying, if you don't need it, don't buy it. That's a business that's saying that. Imagine. There's the work of the Association for Enterprise Opportunities and Cameo in California that are driving the micro-enterprise frontier. The new frontier blazed by the Social Enterprise Alliance and all these new forms of social enterprise trying to address poverty, inequality through new forms of enterprise. There's the development work of all these new robust criteria, from the work of the U.S. Green Building Council in creating the LEED standards to the new systems that are taking us beyond the measurements of the GDP. The investment work of PAX, World, Trillium, Calvert, and all these other responsible investment firms. This is an incredible body of work. Imagine 30 years ago, Ben & Jerry's, The Body Shop, the vision then, the reality now. Every shape, every form in transforming the economy. Yet, in spite of all that, and what actually gave rise to the American Sustainable Business Council was the realization, and the topic of this panel was the ability to get to systemic change. And that was eluding us. And when we looked around, we saw policy at the local, state, and national level as one of the levers for creating that systemic change. And we saw that every time a fair economic policy would get raised, a good environmental policy would get raised, a good social policy would rise up, it was beaten down. And why was it beaten down? Because it's bad for business. It's killing jobs. Bad for business, but bad for whose business? That's the question that we asked next. And when we looked around, it wasn't hard to see the answer. You know the answer. It was traditional business groups, old economy business groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, the Koch brothers, the American Chemistry Council. These same business organizations that have been leading the voice while saying they represent all business, but speaking for the very largest of multinational and national corporations. That became the monolithic voice of business at the White House, in Congress, state legislatures, and in the media. So what we had to do was say it was time to change. And what we did was we said, now we need a business voice and power to go toe-to-toe and head-to-head with the U.S. Chamber. So that's what we set to do to task in creating the American Sustainable Business Council. And Gus, now it is actually over 200,000 businesses through all the different member organizations. It's representing that broad range of sectors like the groups that I'm mentioning. But I want to just quickly run through now the victories that we're showing and in our ability to sort of move policy and the like. In West Virginia, when the Elk River spill happened, we were able to go down to West Virginia and help those business leaders, small business leaders, beat the State Chamber of Commerce and win victories to ensure that state regulations will now be enforced for toxic chemical spills. In Louisiana, we went down and worked with Stay Local and the local U.S. Green Building Council in order to beat back the American Chemistry Council and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce when they went to defeat LEED standards as a way of measuring good progress in buildings and all publicly funded. We beat the chamber there. We worked with Business for Shared Prosperity to beat back Win America, which was with Pfizer, the U.S. Chamber, and others when they wanted to win tax repatriation to bring back their overseas profits that they've been hiding. We stopped Win America and they went home. Yes, we won victories state after state in passing benefit corporation legislation. We beat the American Chemistry Council in opening up the SBA Office of Advocacy from their hidden agenda supposedly to protect small business and move the agenda of Dow Chemical and others. We have won on minimum wage in California and in New York State and are working at the federal level. Alliance and other leaders helped to pass the Crowdfunding Act. Vermont Business for Social Responsibility, our leadership in Vermont, has just won a victory in labeling GMOs in Vermont. Our work through our Business for Democracy frame and working with Free Speech for People, Public Citizen, and others is fighting to overturn Citizens United. 1,500 business leaders have signed on to ban fracking in New York State. And just recently, you know, as the EPA announced, and I'll finish with this one, as the EPA announced its new power plant rules, you know, the Hill, the big political paper in Washington, D.C., did a story. It said business leaders come out in force against the administration and against the PowerPoint rules. It said the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the American Petroleum Institute, the National Federation of Independent Business, and the list went on and on. But, it said, there is another business group, the American Sustainable Business Council, that says to not deal with climate change is bad for business. They applaud the administration for stepping up. It is time to address climate change, to curb carbon emissions, and to begin a new path towards renewable energy. The time is now, and business has a role in driving it forward. Thank you.
Nikki, we are either sitting in our seats or taking the podium.
I'm going to stay right here.
Good.
I think. Can you all see me? No? Okay. I will go to the podium. I'm a little person, so a lot of times I like to stay in my seat, but I wore my heels today, so hopefully you'll be able to see me. This okay? Okay, good. Is everybody awake out there? How about this? Can you stand up? Stand up for me. Put your arms over your head. wiggle your fingers, lean over this way, stretch a little bit, lean over that way, stretch a little bit. Go ahead and bend at the waist and just hang. Take a few deep breaths while you're bending. Slowly creep back up and go ahead and take a seat. Now you're invigorated and ready to listen. Yeah, I was a hardcore camp counselor. I don't know if you can tell. So one of the things that struck me about this panel was that it's about leverage points, right? But to know what the leverage points are, we have to know what needs to change when we're talking about the system. And I was not sure how deep I could get on this audience, but after participating in several of those roundtable conversations, I think we can get deep. We can get real. We can just talk about stuff, right? Good? Okay. So we have climate change, we have human trafficking, we have economic collapse, we have all of these social, economic, and ecological ills. And one of the things that's always struck me about that is that we treat people the way that we treat the planet. A lot of the root cause of this stuff is us. It's how we approach the world. It's our hubris in thinking that we have dominion over one another and over our planet. It's short-term thinking. It's thinking about profits in our lifetime, our pocketbooks in our lifetime. And when I think about things like that, sometimes what the solution is can feel daunting. How do we address this spiritual crisis in our species? Because that's really what we're talking about. And one of the reasons why I'm excited about the organization that I work with is that Green for All to me is a representation of a very concrete, very specific set of tasks that can be done to start to poke away at that deep problem. So Green for All's mission is to build a green economy strong enough to lift people out of poverty, right? The green economy should just be the economy. You exchange resources in a way that is regenerative and not destructive, right? And Green for All wanted to figure out how to do that in a way that didn't crash the economic system and in a way that really supported vulnerable communities. So that's one thing I want to talk about, and then I also want to talk about the collaborative economy as a leverage point. So when we talk about infrastructure as a leverage point, what's the opportunity? There are some cities in this country right now, like Detroit, that have third world water conditions. The National Climate Assessment just came out. It was very clear. All of fresh water is melting into the ocean. We're going to have to come up with something, right? And our water infrastructure in this country is a wee bit out of date. In fact, it would take $188 billion just to revise our water infrastructure to bring it up to code to what it should have been yesterday. That's not including all the research that needs to be done to figure out in the 20 to 50 year projections of climate change, what kind of water infrastructure we're gonna need. One of the things that Green for All did was a big project to try to figure out when water utilities are doing infrastructure improvements, how they could build jobs, how they could build in community benefits for vulnerable communities. What are the high road jobs that are gonna come out of that with good wages and pathways to get promotions? So one other thing that I want to talk about is energy efficiency, right? When the Reinvestment Act came out in 2009, there was $5 billion authorized for weatherization programs. I think it was supposed to weatherize 1 million homes. Now, one of the things with the weatherization training program is that there was this little box that you had to check to let them know whether or not you were a felon if you wanted to get into this program. I've heard a lot of talk about race, and we will get into that. Trust. But one of the reasons why this felon box was so significant is that 1 in 3 African American men will be incarcerated in their lifetime. 1/3 of my brothers. Right? So when we're talking about African American men and employment, 1 in 100 African American women is incarcerated. You can't ignore the incarceration issue when you're talking about jobs. And these are things that I think most of us know. These are things that I think most of us know, And Green for All wants to ask the question, what would it take for the federal government to take away that felon box for the weatherization program? And after hacking and hacking and hacking and hacking in the state of Oregon, actually, we did. There's no felon box. There was no felon box for that program. So when we talk about infrastructure, that is a leverage point that will then start to form a conversation about why infrastructure is so bad in low-income communities, why low-income communities are so predominantly people of color. Now, we're going to out ourselves real quick. Who read all 17 pages of that Case for Reparations article in The Atlantic? Holla. All right. Who glanced at it but did not get through all 17 pages? Who doesn't know what I'm talking about? Okay, so The Atlantic released an article a few weeks ago. The title was The Case for Reparations. It's a serious title, right? 17 pages worth of what happened to African Americans in this country. What's the reparations argument? Slavery-ish. The author was like, no, let's go back 50 years. Just 50 years. How about that? Looking mostly at housing. If you look at the history of this country, and you look at the nearly 400 treaties that have been broken with sovereign American Indian nations, right? When you look at the amount of money that was stolen from African American families who were fairly middle class, who just wanted to buy homes, and were taken by predatory folks that said, you're buying the home from me, who in fact were sold the homes on contract. It's one of the specific things in the article that a lot of people don't know. All of that talk about redlining and all that talk about restrictive housing covenants, there was another practice called giving African American families contracts, where if you owned a home, you rented it to them and gave them all the responsibilities of homeowners with none of the benefits. They didn't build equity, but they had to do all of the improvements on the home. And you could jack up the price whenever you wanted. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were taken out of African American homes through this policy. And there were dozens and dozens of ways that African Americans over the last 50 to 100 years specifically have been systematically disenfranchised from building wealth. So then you go to our communities, our majority black communities that have been systemically disinvested in, and then you look at water infrastructure and energy infrastructure. So we actually have the ability to go back and back and back and back and then get to the root cause of racism in this country, just by having a conversation with someone in the Oregon legislation about a felony box. That's a leverage point. Anything that starts to attack the system itself around these issues gives you the opportunity to trace backward a conversation about the creation of the American ghetto, systemic racism, and actual equality. So one other thing that I want to talk about before I end and move on is the collaborative economy. How much time do I have left? 2 minutes, okay. So quickly. The collaborative economy is being referred to as something that's revolutionary, right? And when I talk about the collaborative economy, I'm talking about peer-to-peer networks mostly. Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, the sharing economy that's just taking everything by storm in tech. I use it. I think it's great. Now, one of the things that's been coming up in the sharing economy is this issue of digital discrimination. There was a Harvard study that just came out in June that looked at the amount of money that black Airbnb users in New York made versus white Airbnb users. And it's something like 12%, you make 12% less, all other factors held equal, if you're a black person than a white person on Airbnb in the city of New York. And that kind of stuff has been documented in the collaborative economy all over the place. People canceling Uber rides. And if you don't know and haven't used Uber, it's a service that allows you to call a car, like a taxi. And when you call a car, a little picture of the driver will pop up and then they're on their way to get you. So let's say you're a white person that maybe doesn't want to ride with an Arab. You cancel the ride and then put yourself back on the Uber list a minute later. That same driver sees that same person, signs up to pick you up again. You cancel again, and you keep canceling until you get a white person to pick you up. This got so prevalent that there was an NPR article about discrimination with Uber. So I say all of that to say that there are these new technologies, and there's new innovations all the time happening that try to equalize the playing field, that try to build new economies. But we are still a racist-ass country. And until we really address why we are so inherently, systemically still racist in our policies, I'm not talking about us personally. That's a whole other conversation that we can get into in the question and answers if you would like to. But the difference between personal and systemic racism is really important to understand. Until we address that issue, the way that we approach the planet is going to be the way that we approach people, is going to be the way that we approach the economy, and we're not going to come up with anything that works. I'm interested in coming up with something that actually works. So the last thing that I'm going to say, to wrap it up, is that this is my civil disobedience plug. One of the things that came out of that Case for Reparations article was the fact that there has been a proposal that has not gotten through Congress to actually study reparations. It would cost $8 million. Dude's been trying to get it to the floor for, well, since 1988, so like 26 years. Not once has it made it through. The last thing I want to say is that another leverage point is us. We need to educate ourselves. We can't be scared to figure out what we've done to each other, what we've done to the planet, and what we've done to our people. And once we do, the real solutions will emerge. So take heart, have courage, be brave, and know that there's people like me that are walking with you.
Well, thank you, everybody. I love the topic of this panel because I think it's absolutely essential that all the sectors, business, government, not-for-profit, faith, figure out our niches in this new clean economy ecosystem. I think there are several roles that government can take. The first one is to seize the bully pulpit, raise awareness about critical issues, and also paint that powerful vision that points to how things could be. A second piece is to support the policies and programs that create conditions that make it more likely for positive change to happen. Now, unfortunately, right now, our federal government is off the rails. And the gridlock that is being produced by partisan ideologues, combined with the fact that too many of our elected officials are more committed to maintaining power than they are to wielding that power for the greater good, has really caused us problems at the federal level. This is one of the biggest reasons that John decided to run for governor, having been a two-term governor before and knowing what that involved, and why I decided to jump into this truly bizarre position of First Lady. And I will tell you, I could do a whole nother speech on that titled How Becoming First Lady Made Me a More Radical Feminist, but that's a different topic. John and I jumped in because we do believe that we're at a point where incrementalism isn't going to cut it. We have got to take on systems change in everything from education to energy, and we're not going to get it right now from our federal government. We really think that state and multi-state regional efforts are our best opportunities for powerful innovation. And if we can prove up new ways of doing things there, we'll have an opportunity to provide what I call trickle-up leadership. I have heard it said that if you ask the wrong question, the answers don't matter. So consider, ever since the onset of the Great Recession, we have been asking, how can we spur economic recovery? But recovery has a sense of going back, of returning to the way things were. And I believe that that is the wrong question. Even before the onset of the Great Recession, the economy was not producing the outcomes that we need. Yeah, GDP was going up, but so were greenhouse gas emissions, poverty, income inequality. The truth is, Americans' ability to achieve upward mobility has been eroding for decades. And this generation of young people, our kids and grandkids, are the very first American generation not expected to be better off than their parents were. We do not need to go back to that. We don't just need economic recovery, we need economic reinvention. I think it should raise alarm bells, and I'm sure it does in this room, that the only time we see a downward dip in deforestation or pollution or greenhouse gas emissions is when the economy goes into recession. It's like economic growth slows and the planet takes a breath. So in Oregon, John and I are starting a different conversation. We're asking the question, does it really make sense to have an economic model that requires continuously escalating consumption of natural resources on a planet of finite natural resources? I mean, after all, as rascally Western novelist Edward Abbey pointed out, growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. Under what John and I are calling the prosperity agenda, we're really working on trying to create conditions that will foster growth that betters everybody, growth that makes us muscular versus cancerous. And I'm going to talk about just a couple of the key components of this. The first one is our healthcare reform. Our national debate on this issue has been asking the wrong question. All of the push has been to get additional people insured, and that is important. But we're failing to ask, insured for what? What should the healthcare system look like? And as a result, we're getting more and more people covered under a healthcare system that is ridiculously expensive and is producing health outcomes that are only marginally better than Cuba's. In Oregon, we asked the question, how can we redesign how we deliver healthcare services to make people healthier and hopefully save money in the process? We received waivers from the federal government to be able to spend our Medicaid dollars on preventative measures versus just after the illness services. And we have created a whole new sector of the workforce. They're community care workers, and they take a proactive approach to working with people in their homes, in the community, to improve their well-being and keep them out of the hospitals, particularly the emergency rooms. It's early, but I can tell you that the numbers we have so far, for every dollar we have so far invested in community care workers, we've saved between $2.50 and $4.50. Another effort that I am super excited about and very personally involved in is the Pacific Coast Collaborative. This is a joint effort of the governors of California, Oregon, Washington, and the Premier of British Columbia. They have come together to sign an agreement to work collaboratively to accelerate clean economy development in that West Coast region and aggressively tackle climate change. The approach is to be really bold within each of our jurisdictions, because everybody has different laws, different structures. We've got to do things a little differently. So do the best we can in each of those 4 jurisdictions in a way that builds a regional clean economy. And I am pleased to report that comprehensive outside assessment shows we've currently got about 500,000 Pacific Coast residents earning clean economy paychecks right now. Those are full-time jobs, they are paying better, they are growing faster, and they have been more recession resistant than the conventional economy. I just say when you put California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia together, we're the 5th largest economy in the world. You pull British Columbia, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon off, we're probably still pretty close to 5th. But if we added some of your states, maybe we could get to 4th. Another piece of the prosperity agenda that was mentioned earlier is our shift to measuring what matters. One of the really brilliant things, in my opinion, insights that John had, he was 2-term governor for 8 years, was out of office for 8 years, and during that time he realized you can't effectively govern a state in a 2-year biennial budget cycle. For instance, you cannot see the return on investment for things like early learning programs or programs that support low-income, at-risk families. But when you go out 5, 6, 7 years, That's an ROI of many, many dollars to one. And so he moved forward with implementation of a 10-year state plan and a 10-year state budget so that we could actually start seeing the implications of some of our policy decisions on our fiscal resources. Meanwhile and prior, I have been part of the movement to move beyond gross domestic product as a way of measuring success for almost 20 years. And we have momentum like I have never seen, people. This is very exciting. So one of the things we're doing in Oregon is we're developing a genuine progress indicator. This is a metric that quantifies fiscal capital just like GDP, but also quantifies your human capital and your natural capital. And we're integrating that into our 10-year plan, and we intend to use it as a filter in developing our next state budget. I'm super excited about that one. And there are a number of states doing this, and if you want more, this is a shameless plug. But if you want to know more about that, you should come to the Beyond GDP workshop tomorrow, where we'll be talking about that. The final thing that I want to talk about is our direct focus in Oregon on poverty. And talking about the poverty crisis in your state is not something that most high-level political analysts will advise a high-level politician to do. But Martin Luther King said, if you don't talk about race, you are going to have racism. And I think the same holds true on poverty. So the governor and I are talking about it, and we're talking about it a lot, and we're talking about it not just as a human tragedy, but also as a tremendous economic drain. We're also talking about the fact that this is not just about lazy people who need to work harder. The reason we have a poverty crisis, in part, is because we have an economic system that is institutionalizing economic classism. I am thrilled to report, and I can't tell you how helpful this has been. We've been effective enough in making the economic argument on this that Oregon's largest business association has gotten on board, and they have recently added poverty reduction as one of the top 3 goals of the Oregon Business Plan. We have really significant partnership there now. And this is personal. This one is personal for me. I have experienced a taste of the destructive force of poverty. I am the first in my ancestry born outside of Oklahoma and Arkansas. That happened because my mom left her first husband for his younger brother, and they had to get the hell out of Dodge. So my older half-brother and sister are my half-brother and sister and my cousins. That's probably not something you expected to hear today. That is how I was born in the Pacific Northwest, for which I am so grateful you can't even imagine. My parents were hardworking but undereducated. We lived up in a shack in the foothills in Washington State and lived without power or electricity for a while. Over time, mental illness and alcoholism took their toll on my parents, and I wound up on my own at 16, and I have struggled financially for most of my life. I know exactly what it's like to have to choose between paying the rent or the electricity. I know what it's like to put off going to the doctor because you got to have that last little bit of gas money to get back and forth to work in between paychecks. I also know that if I hadn't had help, both from caring individuals and from effective systems, I would not have been able to go on to become a first-generation college graduate and be living the life I'm living today. I'm grateful for that, and I'm pissed off that our systems have eroded to the point that they have, where it's harder to do that today than it was when I did it. So these are just some of the highlights that we're working on in Oregon, trying to get to a healthier economic model. I know that all of you are working hard in your niches, trying to get to that same place, and it sometimes feels like a heavy, heavy lift. And for me, when I get to feeling like that one small person trying to change the entire global capitalist structure, it's helpful for me to remember that the economy is not the Atlantic Ocean. It is not the Grand Canyon. It is not a force of nature or an act of God. It is something that humans have made over generations. We invented it, which means we absolutely can reinvent it. And you all are doing that. There are so many examples of the new economy being put into action. This is absolutely the time to lean in to making this a true movement, because we are right, we are necessary, and we are powerful. Thank you.
Well, I think we have time for a few questions. And I don't know where the mics are or how long our minders are going to let us have. We have Mike, you're one of our minders. But those were three great presentations, I must say. Just wonderful. I'm waiting for, oh, here we are. Thank you.
I hope you'll let us know if John's running for president.
One of the reasons he's so effective is he aspires to no higher office. We need more of that.
There's a hand in the back. Eli?
Gus, where was it?
Hi. My question is for the American Sustainable Business Council. I would like to know if you guys are thinking about introducing the idea of business succession to your members, and specifically the idea of selling businesses to employees or to community-owned enterprises, because I think that that would be an awesome, awesome opportunity. And if you're thinking about it, I'd love to work with you on it.
Right. So what the role that we could, this the incredible work that so many worker ownership and, as we talked about, union cooperatives, worker cooperatives and the like are doing. So the role that we are actually playing is in working with some of the leadership of all those organizations to convene them all together. Because this is about how we change ownership in America. And they're each different strategies within this larger frame. So what we're trying to do is within the next couple of months get to a convening where we gather all those different organizations together and look at what are the strategic leverage points to actually drive, whether at a state level, here are the 3 states we need to move, and here's the policies that we can all get behind. Right? And build that sort of collaboration that'll give us the aggregated power that we need to drive the worker ownership and the transformation around, you know, what business looks like and the relationship of employees to ownership. Yeah? So I think there's an opening there to actually build that greater power by collaborating together.
There was a hand back here. Is that over here, this gentleman?
I can't see it. Oh.
Hello, I'm Noah Scheppel from Germany, and I would have a question for David Levine and Sylvia Hayes. I'm working for the Economy for the Common Good, which is a movement of 1,600 companies all around the world that try to redefine economic progress and try to develop a tool to measure the impact of on the common good of a company. And the whole issue of rethinking economic theory and discussing and learning about sustainable and ethical economic practices is an issue that that we're all concerned about, and therefore I would invite you and ask you what you think about the Economy for the Common Good and such initiatives, how far you see that these movements could work together with your organizations.
So what I would just offer is sometimes we've been invited to sit at the United Nations and some of these other gatherings. And what you see is, as in the United States, the U.S. Chamber shows up, the same corporations show up at the international gatherings. So Dow, DuPont, the International Chamber of Commerce. So the small and medium-sized businesses are missing. The responsible businesses are missing. So the only way this works, which is the way we're trying to build it in this country, is by co-joining all the movements. There's folks here in Canada that are looking to start their own business council, right, to drive that. This needs to happen all over the world, and then we need to connect, because that's the way the economy should look, right? From the ground up, connected across localities to regions, as you're talking about, and then into the national, and then across borders. That's the way it begins to look, but it's by realigning these new sets of businesses that we're going to get there, yeah?
I would just add that I am more hopeful about this than I have ever been. I've been working on it for 20 years. We have a momentum around this that is incredible. I think the Great Recession was the opportunity we needed, and the fact that it was global, because people are sensing, they're sensing that something's flawed here. And I will say, your country has been a tremendous leader on this issue, Germany. There are a number of us here and even in the audience who've been part of an international team who have done work in Brazil and Bhutan and here in Boston, funded by the government of Germany, because their interest is so strong in trying to come up with a more effective metric for success. And the GPI, by the way, just got attacked in Forbes magazine a couple days ago. That's awesome. First they fear you, then they attack you, then they follow you.
Mike, do you have one?
Mike.
Hang on. Oh.
Yeah, I think this is a question for David. Endless growth is not only the strategy of the cancer cell, it's the strategy of this mainstream economy we have, but it's also the strategy of a lot of businesses, including a lot of socially responsible businesses like Ben & Jerry's, which, as a Vermonter, I remember when it was a small scoop shop in an abandoned garage, and then it grew into a multinational corporation and eventually bought out by Unilever. And I'm just wondering if there's any systemic limit to growth that you can see that can be imposed on business.
Well, I think that's one for Gus, actually. Yeah?
Well, we definitely need, where's our friend John Fullerton? He had the session here today on, has a paper, wonderful paper on limits to investment. I mean, sooner or later, we need to have corporations dominating that are committed to people and to place and not to profit. And there's a lot that we can do to force that change, not only by creating new systems of new types of corporations that we've had a wonderful session on today with Marjorie Kelly and Janelle Orsi. But there are a lot of things that can be done to rein in the giant corporations as well, like national charters, like bringing more corporations under a type of regime that resembles public utility regulation. And in the essence, what we really need in the end is to have far more democratic control over the investment decisions in our society. Right now, it's the banks that are making the investment decisions. The whole approach to investment is financial return. We need to move to a system where we're financing democratically determined priorities with an eye to social and environmental returns. And that's going to take a huge change and a huge fight. We just got to launch that fight and pursue it. But really, there's sort of two theories. There's some who think that we have got to, in a way, build only from the bottom up, from smaller entities and different new corporation types, and not to worry too much about the big corporations because they're sort of hopeless and there's not much we can do. I actually think it's more of a pincer movement. We've got to go at it from both sides.
Hi. Okay. I have a question for Nikki and the great work that Green for All has been doing, particularly around the water infrastructure. Very impressed with the reports that came out recently about that. But particularly, there is this huge opportunity, as you said, about needing to reinvest in our water infrastructure and think about it differently. And I'm curious if you can speak to the parallel trend of public-private partnerships and privatization of our infrastructure, and just how can we do these investments and make sure that we get maintain public ownership of these assets, and that we can keep the kind of wealth and investment in our communities.
I would say it goes back to that message of be brave. There was a bill, I think, on the books in California that prevented counties, I think, it was complicated, I'm trying to remember it correctly, from generating their own power. And I think the people behind it who were opposed to it obviously were Pacific Gas and Electric, right? And no one was thinking about it when Pacific Gas and Electric put all their money into preventing it from happening. So now the County of Alameda is doing a study to try to figure out whether or not they can generate their own power and be off the grid. And they wouldn't have if PG&E hadn't thrown all the money at it. So I think that there's a conversation in certain counties, in certain states, in certain cities about what it would take for city municipalities specifically to take back some of their ownership of their infrastructure, and what it would take for states to take back the ownership of their infrastructure. And I do think that there's a consciousness and there is a knowing that at this point too much has been privatized, which is why it's so hard to regulate, right? And one of the opportunities that's on the table right now is the EPA. So on June 2nd, they released the carbon emission standards for CO2 emissions. We want to get them down to 2005 levels by 2030. And that's going to take a lot of effort. Not so much by certain states who are already on that track, but it's going to take a lot of effort by other states. And there's a conversation right now, state by state, about how each individual state's going to meet that requirement. And there's an opportunity for state governments to be in a very sophisticated conversation with private energy companies about how they're going to work together to do this. And there's going to be money coming from the federal government to help states figure out how to do this well. So I think the public-private conversation is one of how do we think outside the box? How do we think really strategically about this? And luckily that conversation is happening.
Can I tag on to this, Gus? Got it.
Stereo.
So we're doing something pretty innovative, or we're trying to, with this Pacific Coast Collaborative. We've created an entity, and you can find out about all this stuff online, the West Coast Infrastructure Exchange, and it's based largely on what British Columbia is doing. So the model that's being used in British Columbia, they've been developing infrastructure projects that are public-private. The public maintains ownership of that public works infrastructure project, but the really critical difference that they have implemented is those projects are no longer bid just on design build cost. The developer of that project has to commit to design, build, maintain over time. And so they actually are able to begin to decide on the cost effectiveness of an infrastructure project over its lifetime versus just its construction cost. Really important, and we're working to bring that West Coast wide, and also to be able to aggregate smaller, lower carbon infrastructure projects to a scale that will be interesting to private investors.
Great. We have time for just one last question. This woman has been waiting very patiently. And I know that there are other questions in the room, and I'm hoping that our panelists will be willing to stick around for just a few minutes after we close so that people can come up and ask a few more questions in person if they would like to. Thanks.
Thank you. I just want to Sylvia Hales about the poverty program that you're working on in the Oregon projected budget, what that is, and also just what you think about reframing it in terms of inequality Because I think when sometimes it's focused on poverty, it looks just one level down. It doesn't look at the whole structure. So I just wondered about reframing that.
Yeah, well, what we really have is not a project, it's the overarching framework of our entire administration. And it's extremely integrated. So that what I've done with a team, my prosperity team, we took that 10-year plan that I mentioned, and we worked with all of the outcomes and recommendations from all of the design teams, public safety, healthy people, healthy environment, jobs, economy, etc. And we put a poverty reduction and equity lens into all of that. So the entire 10-year state plan is basically becoming a prosperity plan. Then we also have specific projects. You know, we have Kiva, Oregon. We have a number of things that we've brought in around that. But it's impossible to put a budget on it because it is so integrated. And two of the critical pieces are the way we're doing the healthcare reform there, because it is just disproportionately beneficial to low-income population. We have 400,000 people signed up for healthcare in this new system that didn't have it the first of the year. So that's a big one. And then we're also really trying to get at the generational cycle of poverty through how we're changing our education system with a much greater emphasis on early learning and really, really prioritizing that. So it's pretty comprehensive.
I totally lied. We have one more. Sorry, this is the last question.
Spoiler alert. This question is for Nikki. First of all, I applaud your work that you've been doing. This question is for Nikki, and I wanted to first and foremost applaud the work that you've been doing. Today, since at this workshop, I've received a few questions as a woman of color from some of the other participants of how to increase diversity in spaces like this and in organizations and businesses. What would be some of your suggestions for bringing underrepresented people into the conversation of the new economy and giving them a voice?
Yeah, real simple. The hard part about that question is that the answer is actually pretty simple in my mind, and it's the hardest thing in the world, right? Which is create a conversation in context, in tone, and in execution that addresses our needs. That's actually it. But when it comes to context, those of us that know what it's like to be the only spots of color in the room know that that's a monkey on our back that we carry all the time, usually. That's not a safe or comfortable context for us to exist in, no matter how properly we speak and no matter what background we come from. It's just hard. When it comes to creating the content for that space, all of that conversation that I just had about reparations and about studying it and about black men in prison, my foster brother was murdered when I was 15. Most of my cousins have been in and out of prison. They're all brilliant. And had they had certain opportunities that other people had, they wouldn't be in the situations that they're in. And I carry that. That's actual pain. So there's a level of emotional and social intelligence that's required to actually deal with post-traumatic stress from being a historically oppressed person that I don't think most professional spaces actually cater to. And so And so then that's why you get the phenomenon of us creating our own organizations. Because then if someone breaks down in the staff meeting because their son was just murdered, or their best friend's son was just murdered, or they're that one middle-class person in their family who sees their entire family going through it because they're all still in the hood and couldn't get out or get better or get right, we're going to hold them and we're going to understand. But talking about that and being that in this space is not going to be comfortable unless it's created for that. So one of the things that I think about a lot, and this one's just a question, I think. I don't have an answer for this. But if someone isn't coming to the table as an equal, can there truly be a multicultural space? Our communities of color have been so historically slammed and stolen from that we almost never come to the table equal. Never. So we always feel like we're at a disadvantage when we're at these tables, or we have to fight for everything we have, or we have to be twice as good to get just as far. And I think the best that these kind of spaces can do is really try to do that empathy exercise and say, what would a context and a space look like that was just created for historically oppressed people? What would it look like? If this was a black conference, if the NAACP did this conference, what would it look like? Who would the performers be? What would the panels be on? I mean, just that as an exercise would completely change a conference. But if we're real talk, pay for the reparations study, right? Figure out what it's going to take to not break treaties with sovereign nations that exist inside this country anymore. Like, that's the work. But before we get there, we can start with the right context and the right content.
Well, we all want to thank the panel, especially for what they'll do when they go home.